right. It's recording. We're good.
Yep.
All right. So, chapter 3. So, the main concern of the chapter that I got was that this racial divide between schools and their community. So, I'm just going to jump straight into this, page 63 on my book. I have the second edition, so it might be a little different for you guys. It starts where, I'm not going to read it. It just talks a little bit about how students of color and their families experience interactions in school that leave them intimidated and hesitant to be further included or involved because of it. So how can we as future educators help integrate parents of color into the education system? We've talked before in other classes about the importance of building that relationship with students' parents, but how can we help get them involved in school events and make them feel welcome and want to be involved in their students' education if they're constantly marginalized, feel intimidated and minimized, as the chapter says? So I'll open that up for ideas. What do you guys think?
My kind of section goes into exactly what you're talking about, integrating parents. It suggested an idea that a couple of our other classes have suggested about recording them at home and recording them. One of our classes said recording them playing at home so that you can integrate their culture into play in the classroom. And then in this section, it talks about how you can use this as a tool, like the recording mechanism, as a way to, where's it at? There's a specific part and it's on page, I'll find the page if someone wants to take over and then I'll come back.
Okay.
So 65 in my page, it talks about how parents of color, so it says parents of color of any economic class are compromised because of their lower racial standing in society, which negatively affects the ability to influence schools. And I don't even think, I've seen that happen before, even at schools like Sycamore and Park Tudor. We have parents that are of color that are doctors and surgeons, and they still don't come to school stuff. And parents just, when I had talked to my head teacher, kind of asking are the parents just not involved? Or are they just too busy? And she said some of them have told her that they just don't feel comfortable in the school settings, that they've never felt welcome. And even though they hold this higher degree, obviously they're well educated, they matter to the community, they're doctors, people trust them. They still don't feel like they're welcomed in the schools because of the color of their skin. So I think that also the whole confidence thing, there's parents that are doctors and they don't feel worthy to be at school events. So can you imagine parents that are of color that maybe don't have that higher education, how much lower they even feel? And my dad, he's a very white man, but he got a woman pregnant when he was 15 in high school, and he dropped out of school for a year. And after that, when he came back, the teachers pretty much just wrote him off, you're we're not going to help you, you don't care about your education. So long story short, when me, my brother and sister, we entered the school system, he never came to our parent teacher conferences. He didn't come to our back to school nights. And I had asked my mom what's the deal with that, and she just said he has a bad taste in his mouth from the education system. It failed him. When he went to his job that he's at now, he wanted a position, but he needed to have a degree, a college degree. And within the 3 weeks of being in college, they were like, have you ever been tested for dyslexia? Have you ever this, that? So the college helped him understand why he struggled with learning, why he hated learning, all these things. And it's like my dad's now 48, and like he still has a bitter taste in his mouth, and he's white. So I can't imagine how
Oh,
the parents of color feel that they slipped through the cracks and they weren't cared for, and now they have kids in the education system and they don't want to be there. I think it's
I
so
can't imagine how frustrating that is.
right. And like, if it weren't for my dad to go get a higher level of education, like he would have never been diagnosed ADD or have the medication and all that. But I can't say the same if my dad were to be Black, if teachers in college would have taken an interest in him. And I hate to say that, but that's like the reality. They
yeah.
might have just wrote him off in college too. And then God only knows what my family would look like now without my dad and his degree and all those things. So it's like, it's such a staggered expectations, but it's like, who's going to step in and help?
Right.
I don't know if Paige, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I kind of have like a personal story. So when I was like in like first grade, and my best friend was like a person of color, and like my mom would always get texts for like pizza parties or like eat like Halloween parties, whatever for school, and would be asked to like come in and help. And one time my mom was like, "Oh yeah, like sure." She was like, "Why don't you have Keaton's mom come in and help as well this time?" And the teacher looked at my mom in the eyes and goes, "Well, I just don't think she'd be a good fit for the classroom, honestly." And he was like the only person of color in my entire school. So like I thought about that from like then on. Like obviously my mom didn't tell me like in first grade, but like once I got older, she was like, "Hey, like, like this happened when you were in first grade, and like this is like what was going on." And my mom had like multiple times where like the teacher had said stuff she didn't agree with. So just like, but like looking back now, like hearing like that my teacher literally looked at my mom and said, "Well, I just don't think she would be a good fit for the classroom." And it was purely by race, because there was no other reason. Like it could have been because she was a great person. And it was just like looking back, I'm like, okay, that does not add up. Like that shouldn't have happened.
Was she
No.
a there?
What is it?
Was she a student there?
Her son was a student.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
Yeah,
That
you
makes-
didn't want her to be like the teacher didn't want the mom to be like a room mom because she was Black.
Mhm.
Okay.
Like ask the white moms to come in and be room moms, but not the Black mom to come
Yeah.
in. She wouldn't be a good fit.
After that, my mom was like, "No, like I'm busy, sorry, like not happening."
That just really shows like how the book talks about the official culture of schools is basically white. And
Yeah, the
you
dominant
guys-
culture.
it really shows that.
Like at the end of 65 too, they bring in like Hispanic speaking parents. Like I couldn't imagine my child having to be the one that like translates for me, but also like like they talked about in report cards, like parent teacher conferences, that's like critical information. And I feel like as the teacher, I couldn't be forthcoming because like I'm telling the student how the student's doing and hoping the student tells the parent the right way. So like they had mentioned, like, why don't schools offer language translators on site? Like, I feel like it's something so simple that could benefit everyone, benefit these
Yeah.
students. I couldn't imagine always like having to go with my parents so I can be their translator.
Or pressure on kids.
I was just about to say that, Hannah. That puts so much stress on these students on top of the stress that they already have to pull up their own chair to the table of a quality education. Now there's still that battling divide between home and school life. And these kids are put under such this huge amount of pressure because they have to translate for their parents, and then also are trying to then translate from their parents to their teacher. Like that's stressful for a kid.
Yeah, I can imagine. That reminds me of the part where it talks about where was it? Where they couldn't get the translator because of financial stuff. Where did that go? Oh yeah, okay. So basically it was talking about the bilingual session on 58 of my book. And how not all the attendees are bilingual and English only speakers, so they benefit from the event, but they basically were getting a translator for people who spoke Spanish, but leaving other languages as part of future planning. They kind of just said, like, forget everyone else. But we're just gonna get a Spanish translator for now. I kind of was like, I don't know how to feel about that.
I mean, I feel like if you're going to get a translator, get one with more of a broad language. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but get one that speaks like Spanish, English, like what your school requires. Like, look for that then. Don't just like hire the first person you see on the street. Like, do you speak Spanish? Cool. Come in here to my classroom. Like, if you're going to give that opportunity and give that resource, you need to give it to everybody, because that's what put us in this situation in the first place.
I agree. Do you remember what you were gonna say to the last question? Sorry, I forgot to come back to you.
I don't, but I do have a good
Go ahead, girl.
on page 73, 74, where it starts off a funds of knowledge. That's what my whole paragraph is about, like a funds of knowledge approach and culture and power. And it addresses it first by saying that teachers must help students of color to demystify the culture of power by knowing how it works, instead of like being fearful of it and like steering away from it. And then it goes in to talk about how a funds of knowledge approach to minority communities opposes the deficit orientation by considering the worth of people according to their own standards regarding what knowledge is of most worth and value, and not from an external lens that disparages them. That kind of ties into like what we were just talking about, like how if taking this approach, like a funds of knowledge approach, which would be characterized by like issues of power enacted in classrooms, there are codes or rules for participating in power. The rules of culture are reflected of the rules of the culture of those who have power. If you're not already a participant in the culture of power, being told explicitly the rules of that culture makes acquiring power easier, and power are frequently least aware of it or willing to acknowledge it and its existence, i.e. white people. Those with less power are often aware of its existence. So it just kind of talks about, rather than starting from the premise of like impoverishment and like becoming poor, it begins by affirming the wealth of knowledge that a culture possesses versus like your financial backgrounds. And that a lot of times is paired up with power in this society. Like white men with money tend to be the highest in power. And because these minority families are coming from a place of impoverishment, they aren't seen as like a knowledge base of power because they don't come from a lot of money. And we live in a society that if it's not ran by money and if it doesn't stem the economy, then it doesn't matter.
Basically useless.
That's what they constantly do in my section 2 with what they call banking education. So they talk about how at testing time, the knowledge was deposited into the student's mind, or the knowledge that was deposited into the student's mind is withdrawn to be traded in for a rating to assess the school's adequate yearly progress under the No Child Left Behind Act. And the funds of knowledge approach is guided by a principle that regards all students as capable learners within a context where knowledge is negotiated rather than transmitted, if that makes sense. So just kind of giving them that equal opportunity, disregarding money and how that's happening. It's their knowledge and about their culture and the power within it, and the call for a difference. And does anyone have anything they want to add to support that, or about banking education, or like the students, their knowledge being withdrawn to assess YP.
Yeah, so on page 61, they actually talk about how for certain populations, the match between home and school cultures appear almost seamless. That there's all these other countries that have gotten it right, and their culture is reflected in the schools. It's reflected when they walk down the street. It's not this huge, like, you're in America, learn English. You're in America, we're not doing this. Learn English, do this, do that, pay your bills, pay your taxes, blah, blah, blah. But it talks about how, kids all around the world, now granted, not saying that all of them
Right.
are getting this, higher level of education that refers to them. It helps them. And it's like, we're one of the supposedly the greatest place to live. We have
Mhm.
all this money, we have all these resources at our fingertips. Like, what's our excuse? Why is there such a lack of, when we literally have everything we need here? We have every ability, every finance to get whoever we need here. I mean, like, it's not like we're just in this bubble and nobody can help us. Like, we have all the resources, all the money, all the time, shit. And yet we don't, we're like the lowest.
It
Like, it just doesn't add up.
literally doesn't make sense. Like, us being third person, like, point of view, I look at this and I'm like, how does an operating, functioning brain really think that this can work? And it's because there are narrow-minded, rich white people that are in places of power, and they're the
Mhm.
ones that call the shots because they're the ones that sign the checks.
And they're also the ones that say that teachers should make $5 an hour
And
and
they're
just
the ones that
stay
implement
happy
the
'cause they're
policies.
making a change.
Exactly.
It's
Right?
like, how do you think that doctor became a doctor? You think he just like taught himself, like, or
Exactly. Right? No, my book makes a really good point on my book, your guys' book, and my section makes a really good point on that in regards to the second central power as like a tool. It says the second regarding cultural power as a tool that students can use rather than one that disempowers them, provides educators with a way of teaching students about relations of power and how to have a healthier relationship with authority in general, which is huge. And it goes on to talk about this. Where to just go, then provides educators a way of teaching students about relations of power and how to have a healthier relationship with authority in general, whether in form of school tradition like official curriculum or institutional leaders like teachers and administrators, because most people in leadership positions, from principals to work supervisors, are likely to be white. Children of color learn to be comfortable with their presence, knowledge about cultural practices, and at ease in dealing with them. If these authorities remain mysterious to students of color, they will probably resist them, some forms of which may further marginalize them. So we see we don't have a really big culturally enriched, diverse educator community. Like, the teacher community tends to be prominently white. I mean, especially when you look at our class,
say our class.
predominantly white. And we, as white teachers, need to acknowledge the history of some of these cultures and the way that white people them. And we need to be the ones that take this funds of knowledge approach to these minority and marginalized groups and communities, and just let them know, yes, we are an authority figure because we're your teachers, but I'm not looking at that from an external lens that's going to discourage you in the classroom or make you think that you're any less capable of earning a quality education because of the culture that you come from. Or every student, regardless of their culture, deserves a quality education. And we see time again and time again in these books where they talk about, if you integrate that, it goes hand in hand for an enriched education, and we just don't do it because it's unfamiliar. We're not familiar with it, or we're not comfortable with it, or we don't know. But you don't know until you try. And it said something in one of our books, like the best way to go into this approach is to walk in and close the door, like just go all in. And I thought that was pretty cool.
So page 66, it talks about how we do not require white teachers to adapt cultures of color. Instead, we expect people that do not speak English to learn English. We expect students that do not know to learn. Pretty much like puts everything off on everyone else but us. Like, so it kind of talked more into about like, we know what we know because we've been taught it, right? But like, what happens once we leave our education program? Like, what do we do? Do we just stop learning? Do we just say, okay, well, I read 5 racism books, so I know
Like,
what
I'm done.
right. So,
Yeah.
and like, if anyone comes at us like, oh no, we know, we read this book from 1962, so we definitely know.
Probably written by a white guy. Like, no, I got it.
And I watched the news today, so, and I went to a rally, like a Black
I
Lives
watched
Matter rally,
CNN today.
so, I mean, I'm relevant.
No, but
I don't
really,
know.
though.
It's just like for me, I like reading stuff like that. It's like, it's so true though. Me being in the school systems, like now as like a teaching assistant, there's no training, none, zero, zip, nada. Like we get nothing. Not like we don't, like I learn about the conscious mind, and I've learned about knowledge is power. I've learned about, I'm trying to think of other professional development days I've had. Behavioral management, like things like that, but not like the hard nitty gritty shit, like the
Stuff
stuff
that
that actually matters. So it's like they spend all these dollars. I mean, they get all these different speakers, all these different presenters. We have this like massive Chick-fil-A lunch and this spread of breakfast, but like I leave learning not a damn thing. Like,
I was gonna say, what
nothing
are they learning
happened.
about getting Chick-fil-A every day for lunch?
Right. I'm just like, okay, so I'm going to get free lunch. That's cool. I'm going to get paid. I get a day off from the kids. Like, awesome. But like, I actually don't learn anything because they're sitting here saying that it's not required, that we just expect everyone else to get on our level and move on. Like,
Right, like
why do
why
you
are they the ones who have to adapt to us? Why can't we adapt to them? Because America has been built on this representation that we're this big melting pot, and yet why isn't that idea of this melting pot and that being the core of America, then why isn't that implemented in schools? Because that's why people grow up and they think that this is okay, because it's not taught to them in school that you can learn from other cultures other than one that's white. You can learn from other scholars that aren't white and still be successful. You can learn things from a different culture, even if it's not your own.
Kids spend more time, I feel like, in school than they do anywhere else. Like
Anywhere, most of the time I saw my teachers more than I saw my parents.
yeah, exactly. So they're gonna learn most likely gonna be from their teachers. So
Paige,
All
what do
right.
you think?
Sorry. Just in reference to like what Libby was saying, I don't know.
How do we, about the whole, like, we're supposed to just be good to go after we leave school, but everyone else is supposed to like learn how to work around.
Yeah. Honestly, like when I think about it, it terrifies me because like I know like my political stance, like I'm very liberal, so like I know I keep myself as like up to date as possible, but I know that's still nowhere near like living in someone else's shoes. Like I'm still just like not there. And like obviously like that's something I never, like none of us will be able to ever do. But like you keep, like I follow a bunch of like teacher pages on like Instagram and like stuff like that, just like to keep up with like stuff. And I look at it and I'm like they'll post like, oh, like read this book, and I'm like, oh, okay, and like I'll get the book and I'm like, this actually doesn't pertain to anything, and I haven't, like I have no knowledge, and like I don't know, even just in general, like because some of the professors we have, like I like them all, but like say like, oh, well, this is like what I like, and this is what, and then another professor says like completely something that contradicts it. So I'm like, wait, well,
Which-
what do I actually do? Like,
Yeah, I know what you're talking about in reference to like the constant debacle we go back and forth with like the people of color. Some people like it, some people don't.
mhm,
And I think that kind of goes back on like, you can't ask one person of a specific culture how an entire culture feels or how an entire community feels. You can't ask a Black person, like, hey, what do your people like to be called? Because it's just kind of like, well, I can't really speak on behalf of them, but the only thing that, not the only thing that we can do, but one thing we know we can control is that we can educate ourselves
yeah,
as much as we can. And just like you said, Paige, you hit it right on the nail. Just staying as educated as you possibly can and staying as up to date and getting yourself into these, you know, social media, perfect opportunity. Collins talks all the time about Black Twitter. I want to get on that. I want to get in there because I want to learn about these issues and I want to learn what people are pissed off about. Why are you upset? Because I want to make sure, one, I don't ever do that consciously or subconsciously. I don't want to ever do that. So a way that we know that we can eliminate that in the classrooms and just then becoming natural is just to constantly educate ourselves. And I think this book does a really good job in bringing to light some issues and problems that we as white women don't necessarily see as a problem because it doesn't exactly pertain to us. But that also doesn't mean that that's not a problem, which is what people are still failing to see, that just because it's not a problem to us directly doesn't mean that it's not a problem. And that's why it's not taken as a priority that this book talks about over and over again through different examples, that just because it doesn't pertain to us doesn't mean that we can just turn a blind eye and just not pay attention to it, because these minority and marginalized groups are paying for it in school. They're not getting a quality education because it just isn't served as a priority to the people who are supposed to be guiding them in education.
I think like going back to what you said too is like sometimes I think the way to address like race or even like sex, like women like women male, all the things, it's like it's a person to person thing too. Like
Mhm.
what Colin says he likes may be different from what Dr. Taylor says. And like me being gay, like me and Rachel have different viewpoints on certain things. Mind you, we're different ages. We've gone through it at
Mhm.
different times. Like we both came out, our stories are, things are just different. And like the way that I see it, like the LGBTQ, blah, 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 SXXY, like I don't look
Right.
at it like that, but she does. She
Right.
likes all the extra letters. Like people ask questions about like trans people to me. I have no idea. I'm not trans, I'm
Right.
very much a female. Like
I'm a part of the LGBTQ plus, but I
right.
do not know I cannot speak
Like,
on their behalf.
exactly. I can't speak on them. And I think too,
Mhm.
like for race issues, like older Black people may have different views on like the word
Than
color,
younger Black people,
or
100%.
you know, like maybe they prefer African American because they think it's more respectful. Then like the newer age are like, no, we are Black, say we are Black, capital B that. We are, you know, like there's just things that are different. And I feel like even in this class, learning from different professors and like their age and their like gender is different.
Oh,
Things
yeah.
matter more to them. Like this may matter more to you because you're a female than a male. So I think like too with our students, it's not necessarily like they're all Hispanic. We treat them all the same, but like, okay, you are Hispanic, but you were born in America. You have never spoke a lick of Spanish. Like I can't put you in the same category. That's not fair.
Literally, Caleb, he's Hispanic, 50% white. You would never,
Like it's
ever know
different.
because he
It's
grew up
different. You know,
in majority white area. So he's like, I never really got in touch with my, Hispanic culture. They didn't provide it in my classroom. My Hispanic family doesn't live locally. So like the only thing I know is what my mom tells me and the food that we eat. And, she does her best to culturally integrate that into the home, but when you live in a white community and your school is predominantly white, it is hard to fully integrate that kind of that cultural shift and that cultural blend between American culture, which whatever that even is, and then Hispanic culture. And I want to kind of touch on what you said earlier about the different viewpoints between generations, because yes, the like Black students, absolutely. Hispanic students, absolutely. Asian American students, I want to talk on that and see if you guys have anything, because they often get paired with like excelling and being paired with white students in reference to the system being like set up for them to succeed like it is for us. But that's really not true, because the amount of pressure that these kids have on them, like if we look back at the history of Asian American culture, like their grandparents and their parents or their great grandparents had to go through hell and high water to get to this country for everything that it provides. And they wanted that for their children and their children's children. And they did whatever they had to do to get there. So missing school, no, is not an option, because I didn't just bust my ass to get to this country for you to take a day off because you don't feel like going to school. Like I remember my boss actually last night, I was doing reading while I was at work, and he was asking me what I was reading about, and I was telling him about it, and he was like, I vividly remember one kid who had perfect attendance kindergarten through his senior year of high school. He was an Asian American student. He was like, I never saw that kid miss a day of school. And I explained to him, I was like, well, think about where they come from. You know, I'm sure his grandparents or his great grandparents, had to go through a lot to get here. So they probably value their education a lot differently. But you see often in kids, they're surrounded by their white peers. And a movie that actually just came out on Netflix called Moxie. I don't know if you guys have heard it. If you haven't, please watch it. It's amazing. It's about women empowerment, and it brings up a lot of like social justice issues and civil rights issues and women equality and racial divide in schools. And it talks about this girl. She's an Asian American student. She wanted to stand up for the Moxie is what it's called, but it's women empowerment. She wanted to support that movement, and they all wore tank tops to school because their dress code was directed at women. And there was a scene where is wearing a strappy tank top, but a woman with kind of a heavier bust was sent home and taken out of class because her collarbones were distracting, is what the principal said. And the Asian American student wore the tank top to school, refused to cover up, as well as everyone else, and took the fall for Moxie, because Moxie is an anonymous. They chose it to be an anonymous, like they do it through like zines and like have all these like pictures and quotes of like things that are going on in the school. Anyways, I'm rambling, but she was suspended, and her mom was enraged and was like, you are to wash every carpet in this house, to repent for your sins, for getting kicked out of school. Like she said, a quote in the movie, my mom would rather me get a flesh-eating bacteria than ever miss school. And she's like, but you stood up for a good cause. You stood up for women's rights, and you did that. And she's like, you will never understand what this has done to me because you're white. Like, you don't understand what my mom and my grandma had to go through to get me and my family here quality education. And you'll never get that because you're not in my shoes. And that was just kind of like a really eye-opening experience. And that kind of lens, that cultural funds of knowledge and this base of knowledge of different cultures, you have to look at it through that lens and not a white lens, because that's where things tend to fall through the cracks, like Haley was talking about earlier.
I think a lot of times it shows that with like the whole topic of what you're talking about. It represents that in a lot. And I'm thinking of that. What is that one movie where those three college guys, one of them is Asian and his dad tells him he's going to be a doctor or something, and then he totally like is against it. I'm trying to
I know
think
what
of
you're talking about, and he wants to be something else.
it's hilarious.
That
It's a fun,
movie.
I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, that's what it made me think of that because a lot of the time in the media, they show that pressure that Asian students have.
It is. They have really high standards set for them at home and at school because, I mean, as educators, we see them year after year in honors classes, AP classes, like they're doing great. So we set that bar up for them. So also, they're another group of students who oftentimes have to translate for parents and teachers. So it's just a lot of pressure under these kids, and they're kids. Like, that's what we fail to realize. They're not adults like us. Like, these are kids, and they have all this pressure put on them. It's crazy.
No, I agree. I just want to keep track of time. What time is it?
It's 10:48.
48.
Okay. Do we have time or has it been 30 minutes?
It hasn't been just yet. No.
Okay. Then I wanted to talk about this just because I feel like we'll have a lot to say about it. That's not it. It is on page 67 where it says, because schooling is by and large tied to neighborhoods, housing segregation produces school segregation. Although integrated schools exist, because of segregation, most Black children attend schools populated with other Black children. This made me think of well, first I wanted to know if you guys agree that where you live and the housing segregation, it produces this school segregation.
So I live in Washington Township School District, and 2 years ago they actually redistricted students. So what was happening was that like Washington Township also falls into the lines of like Meridian Hills, Allisonville Road. So those are like really big, expensive homes. So
Mhm.
like schools like Clearwater and Allisonville, Fox Hill within Washington Township were these really predominantly white schools within Washington Township, and like they were money driven and things like that. So what Washington Township decided to do was redistrict these students to have like the schools kind of more equal. So even though like Clearwater is literally smack down kind of like in Meridian Hills, they redistrict students that were like from Spring Mill and Nora that were kind of like lower on like the poverty line into like those bigger schools, but they also put students that were higher up in like Spring Mill and in Nora and all that, and parents had a heyday.
I was just
They
about to ask you, what
lost-
did the parents have to say about
they
that?
lost their minds.
I'm sure.
They absolutely lost their minds. They were putting in request forms to go back to their school or going to even quote unquote better schools. Mind you, this is the same district. It wasn't like
Right,
were
like what makes it a better school? Because it's a bigger
they
building,
weren't
because it
taking
has more
them
money?
out of like the school system, like the district. They were just taking them out of schools. And IPS did this a few years ago too, and parents lost their minds because also IPS schools fall within Meridian Hills and within these really like predominantly more like uptown, more rich
Mhm.
areas. So what happened was is a lot of these parents pulled their kids and they put them in Bishop's Retard, Rebuff, Park Tudor, Sycamore, Orchard, St. Luke, Immaculate Heart.
Translate, those are all like what kinds of schools?
Private. They
Got it,
they
okay.
took them out. They said, okay, so you're not going to let us go to the public school we want, because like all these like rich people love to support public schools because
Mhm.
it's like they're doing good,
Right.
but they're like really not.
As long
So-
as they go to Carmel.
Yeah.
As long as it's like a Carmel school.
So
then we're
like
good.
these parents like were so like also Washington Township lost the reform. So the reform, I don't know if you guys are like familiar with what a reform is. If you're not a homeowner, it doesn't affect you. But what happens is you end up paying more on property tax, and that property tax is given back to that school district that's in your surrounding area. So like places like Indianapolis, a lot of parents vote no because they for real can't afford it. Like, it's not that
Right.
they don't care about the schools. It's truly like, they're like, shit, we're barely making ends meet as it is. Like, you can't up our taxes. Now, places like Danville and like Plainfield, they are hardcore Republicans, and they have a shit ton of land. A lot of them, they're farmers. That's where farmland is. So they vote no because they're like, absolutely not. You're going to hit us hard. But
And this is how we make our money.
that's how the schools need. That's how you get more resources for the schools. That's how you get more funding for the teachers. That's how it all comes full circle. So we're relying on our parents that make like nothing to vote for us, but really it's like you can't look at it that way. You can't say like they're voting against you when they can barely put food on the table. Like, they're just trying to survive. But the upper class parents are like, they have the signs in their yard that's like, vote yes, support our school, support the teachers. And it's like, you just ripped
Where's your
kid out of
checkbook, babe?
school.
Where's your checkbook?
But that's the thing, the minute their kid isn't where they want them to be, they're out of the school. And these parents will have if you guys look at polls and stuff, parents that live in these predominantly like white, richer neighborhoods, they'll let their kids go to a public school up until middle school, and then they yank them and put them in a private middle high school. So they support public education until like it really quote unquote matters. So it's such like a, man, like I said, I'm old. I'm older than you guys. And I just lived here longer, and the boys that I nanny, it's kind of like that same thing. I love the boys I nanny, but the mom's the same way. The oldest one right now is in public school, and she's so for it. But as soon as he hits middle school, she's like, yeah, we're looking at like probably Park Tudor, Bishop Chaptard, or like Rebuff, just, to get like right now he's getting a great education, but when he has to, go to middle school, I'm like, oh, so when he has to mix, what you're saying is when that
the underlying message is
mix with other schools, so then the school is going to become like really diverse. It doesn't fit your standing anymore. That's when the issue happens. And the same things are said about IPS schools. Like School 84 is like this supposed incredible IPS school, which I'm like, they're all IPS. Just so we're all clear, they're all IPS. They're great, but they're not great when they all have to start intertwining. And they have to say, and then to send them to like North Central High School, gasp, can't do that. You just cannot. That is it's just too big. And I feel like he'll begin to slip through the cracks. And he wants to play basketball, but I don't think he would have a good shot there. Oh, so you mean your white son isn't going to have a good chance because you're assuming that the black students at North Central are going to get on the team before your white child, because you're also assuming black children want to play basketball. Okay. Right. I just want to make it very clear.
I just want it to be known what it is you're actually trying to say, because your underlying message, that's what this says.
That's actually what you mean. So Hannah, to go like full realm into your question, or what the thought is, I think that you try to make these public schools diverse, and the community does matter, but then you have schools that are like super failing because they were in the same district. It just is such a weird, like, double-edged type sword. Like, you never know what's going to happen. And you do have, I don't want to sit here and bash parents that live like in Meridian Hills. You do have some really great parents there, nevertheless. Right. But it's also like a lot of them, when that redistricting happened, a lot of their true colors showed, and they pulled their child out because it was too diverse at that point.
That's ridiculous. I think, a lot of it has to do with the parents. Like, your parents literally choose everything for you when you're a student, Like, my mom, And Dad, literally, we live on the line that separates Hendricks and wow, what is it called? Hendricks and we're Ben Davis, and it starts to go downtown. What is that? What township is that
Marion
called?
County.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marion County. We live on the line. And I always wondered, I was like, why didn't I go to Ben Davis? And I would ask my parents that because I live like walking distance from Davis. And I live 20 minutes from Avon where I went to school. And my mom and dad were always like, it's just a better school. Like they showed me, I didn't really realize until I got older, but I was like, wow, you literally just didn't want me to go to a school that had mostly Black people. Like, not to throw them under the bus or anything, but
But I mean, our parents just come from such a different upbringing that they think that that's the best way, and it's not.
it's really not. It's just damaging it down in the future, I feel like. But I haven't shared my racial biographies yet, but I mean, I was raised in a church where that was on like Lyndhurst, if you guys know where that's at. It's on Lyndhurst Drive, and it was so diverse. So like that was the only real diversity that I got was from that church, because Avon still today is like 90% white students, 90% white educators. Like, wow, like when is that gonna change?
Never.
Literally.